Came across an interesting feature piece in the Daily Mirror, which I think warrants a bit of discussion. So the piece is by Emily Ritter. It's from Saturday, the 6th of March, 2021, and it's about the great niece of the infamous gangster Al Capone, Deirdre Capone. She is a writer. And basically, I'll just show you the feature. Don't know how clear that is. Uncle Al loved cooking and playing Santa for us. He was just a mobster, not a monster. Ruthless Bootleg King was a softie with his family. So basically, the article it's in a kind of interview format, and it's a piece about this writer, Deirdre Capone, who's his great niece. She has her own Facebook page. I don't know how successful she is as a writer, but she's 80 years old, and she says that she is probably the last person on this earth to have properly known him. And she's chatting from her home in Florida as the latest movie about her beloved Uncle Al is released on Netflix this week. I don't know if that's the one starring Tom Hardy or it's yet a new one. Hardy was in a biopic about Capone, which I think got mixed reviews. Um, this is interesting because she's obviously a family member. Now, the natural instinct of most people is to defend family members. Um, but to me, there's a fine line between giving your perspective on something, someone that you knew personally, and just serving as an apologist for them. And I think she kind of falls under the latter from what I've seen of this. There's an interesting dynamic to this because I've no doubt that what she's saying is true in terms of him being a good family man. And, he was great with the kids and he dressed up as Santa and all the rest of it. The Cray twins here in Britain, they would have charity functions. The top mobsters, you even get this more recently, like the Mexican cartels, they are portrayed in some sources as Robin Hood type figures. Of course, they're nothing of the sort. They're ruthless criminals whose tactics are just as sadistic as ISIS. Um, and that's something I think we should never lose sight of. I've got a lot of mob films, including Legend with Tom Hardy. It's a great film. In British culture, the Krays kind of go beyond just your regular criminal. They have become kind of iconic figures, particularly in the social history of London, London's East End specifically. But in the end of the day, they were just criminals, whatever way you gloss it over. And I think it's a little bit sad that the man who apprehended them, Nipper Reid of Scotland Yard, he got a little bit of coverage in the press when he died, but that was it. There was no heroic funeral. There was no, this is the guy who brought down the craze. And yet they were treated like heroes. They weren't heroes, they were criminals. Um, so when we look at mob films, some of them are really good films in terms of, I'm talking cinematically. The Godfather's often ranked as one of the greatest films ever made. And I admit, I still haven't seen it the whole way through. I've seen bits of it. Um, But there's a lot of mob films I can point to as being powerful films. A Bronx Tale. Um, Once Upon a Time in America was good, but it was a bit on the long side. Other mob films, Legend was very good with Tom Hardy. The thing about Legend was, on the surface, it could look like it's glorifying the Krays, but what was interesting is it was through the viewpoint of Frances Cray, who of course had a pretty tragic life. She committed suicide as a young woman, being trapped in this abusive marriage with I think it was Ronnie Cray. And so when you look at it from that perspective, and the filmmakers pointed this out, it's not from his perspective, it's from her perspective as someone inside, but who suffered from that life. So in that sense, you could almost argue that Francis Cray was one of the victims in that sense. Um, I do think, though, I've seen young men who kind of look at mob films and they do genuinely admire gangsters. There's no getting away from this. I think it's very important to look at mob films as an art form, as a biographic of famous people, albeit people who were involved in crime. Some of them, of course, are fictional. Um, there's others that I haven't mentioned. Gangster Squad, that's more from the police perspective. And there's others as well. There's British ones. Long Good Friday is a great British mob film with it's Bob Hoskins, Bob Hoskins, and Helen Mirren. But I think there's a few things to look at with this. Firstly, a family member is going to be biased in almost all certainty, but I would make an analogy here, and it's a loose analogy because it's not exactly the same thing. During the war and during the Holocaust, there were reports of SS guards who would literally, and a famous example of this is Eamon Gough, who was played by Ralph Fiennes in Schindler's List. When his daughter first heard about his crime, she was in disbelief. She didn't want to believe it, and she thought that Spielberg and others were just demonizing her father. But when she'd done her own research, she started realizing, well, actually, it's true. Um, so that's an example whereby SS officers would come at home at night. These were intelligent, sophisticated men. They were cultured. They would listen to nice music. They'd kiss their wife. They'd put the children to bed. The very same person had probably gassed 3,000 men, women, and children that day. So there was a duality of maybe it was their way of coping of this with this great evil. And there's other examples in history where people would do evil things, but then they would almost have a dual personality where they would have a normal life. Stalin is a very famous example. Joseph Stalin was said to be a good family man, not so much with his daughter Svetlana, she famously defected, but he was always said to be a good family man, and yet he was a ruthless dictator responsible for millions of deaths. So I do think there is this duality whereby psychopaths, sociopaths, and people who are capable of doing very ruthless and evil things almost have a split personality whereby they have a normal life, a family life, hobbies, you name it, um, and they use that all as a way of almost, I don't know if it's coping or normalizing their life. I mean, even Hitler was big on animal welfare. So, I think she's a bit deluded, frankly, this writer. Just because he was nice to her, just because he was a nice family man, doesn't mean that, and in the article you can see that she's really trying to downplay his crimes, you know. I don't think actually Al Capone was the most sadistic of the Prohibition era mobsters. There was others that were probably more sadistic, Lucky Luciano, and there were probably some others. But he was certainly one of the most notorious, probably the most famous. Um, and I think that's just the message from it. People can have a pleasant side, but still do evil things. Whether they've convinced themselves that the evil things are for a greater good, whether they've convinced themselves that, I mean, I have no doubt these Mexican cartels justify their actions because I don't know, they give out money in the community or I don't know what goes on inside the mind of a criminal. But ultimately, in the end of the day, I do think we need to be a little bit careful that, particularly with films, that they are just an art form and they are just a depiction of someone's life. I do think we need to be careful not to allow that to kind of romanticize these figures. No matter how powerful the film is, in the end of the day, Al Capone, the Cray twins, you name it, they are just famous criminals. That's what they ultimately are. They may well be family men. They may well be even good fathers, but they are still ruthless criminals, and that side cannot be downplayed and shouldn't be something to aspire to. It's one reason why I detest contemporary rap culture because I do think it glorifies basically thug lifestyle. I do think that drill music, especially, If you really look at that stuff and think that it doesn't literally have an impact on turf wars, then you're being very, very naive. I know a teacher, and he has said that in schools that he's worked in, you will literally have drill videos, people naming their rivals and dissing them with street language. And then that person, they feel that they've been humiliated. And these videos are maybe viewed by thousands of people. And then they're going down the street and people are laughing at them. So then they need to get revenge. So drill music literally fuels gang wars. That's why I think it's so toxic. And people who say it's just music, they're deluded. They don't know what they're talking about. Anyway, I'll round this up. I also believe, I've never denied that I'm pretty conservative on crime. I don't think that convicted criminals, whether they be mob bosses, whether they be drug lords, those sort of criminals should not be allowed to profit from a crime. So if they release a book, for example, a biography, there's 2 points. There's the freedom of speech argument. Okay, they've served their time, they've come out, it's freedom of speech. But I do think that it's morally wrong that they should profit from promoting their crimes if it isn't written in such a way as to defend what they have done. I would even say there should be a stipulation that some of the profits should go to victims of crime. I remember there was a notorious case in Australia, Jeffrey Leonard. You might be familiar with this if you followed the case. And he was actually publishing books that were available in Victoria libraries. I think it was Victoria, it may be New South Wales, I think it was Victoria. Now he'd served his time, he'd been punished for what he'd done, but he had no remorse. And he was literally publishing these books gloating about being a predator, giving tips to other predators. I think that should be illegal. Um, because it's insulting victims of crime. It really is. So, there's different angles to look at with that. But just to be clear here, I'm not saying that mob films should be banned or censored or anything like that. I think if they're done in an intelligent way, they have merit. Because most people don't watch a mob movie and think, oh, that's something to aspire to. Most people have the intelligence to understand that. So in that sense, I think it's very, very different from drill music. Drill music is very, very specific. Um, However, I do think that mob films, in some cases, you do get some young men who do think there's something to aspire to there, and those individuals need to be kind of told that it's not. I'd be very supportive of an idea of a former mobster or drug lord or you name it. They've served their time, and then they're encouraged to do speaking tours around schools, warning young people against crime as part of rehabilitating into society after they've done their time. They have to be punished first for what they've done, but when they have been punished, when they've served their time, I think that's a very healthy way to reintegrate them into society. And it's a win-win because it's good for positive influence on young people. It's good for them as well because they're turning their lives around. They're doing something positive, and they can feel that they're doing something positive rather than being a blight on society. So I'd be all for something like that. But someone like Deirdre Capone saying, "Oh, my uncle, my great uncle was a big softie." Yeah, I'm sure that downplays all the ruthless things he done. So it's something to think about.